Hello, and welcome to this week's We Love History Live. I'm Steve, an interpretation manager with Historic Environment Scotland, and I'll be talking through a mobile phone propped up on a teetering stack of books on my dining table with my colleague Laura, one of the brilliant historians in our indispensable cultural resources team. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Steve. Hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be here. Like Steve said, I'm a cultural resources advisor here at HES. I've also got a PhD in Scottish history, where I looked at modern commemorations of the medieval past. So I often joke that I'm more interested in what people think happened in the past than what actually happened in the past. So I think the conversation today is going to be perfect for that.
I hope so. Well, I'm certainly no folklore expert, but as part of my job sharing stories with our visitors, I always love to use folk tales whenever I can. They're a sort of colourful and important part of the intangible heritage of our sites, and they help give meaning to many of our monuments. By definition, they are memorable stories, told for generations before being written down. So let me continue the introductions with a rather unpleasant individual. That's not me. It's a trow, a malevolent fairy-like creature that people once thought dwelt inside ancient burial mounds, like Cooing Hill, Chambered Cairn in Orkney. And if you visit this remarkable tomb, once lockdown restrictions are lifted, then you'll find this troll, or this trow, well, a picture of it, glaring back at you from one of the site's interpretation panels, because this creature is every bit a part of a Cooing Hill's heritage as the Neolithic farmers who built the cairn. Locals told stories about the trow that haunted Cooing Hill for generations. And even though we don't believe those stories are true, that doesn't mean they have no value. On the contrary. So in a sense, this afternoon, we're going on a trow hunt.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of our plans for our discussion today, we're going to explore a little bit about what myths actually are, what we mean when we say myths. why they matter, and then also why they matter to us at HES, and the over 300 historic monuments that we care for, many of which are homes to these sorts of legendary tales that are every bit as engaging as this one about the trow, I can assure you. So we'll both be telling a lot of stories today, many of which are linked to some of our properties. And then we'll also be answering some questions. So please do chip in on the live chat with your questions or your thoughts on myths and legends and their role in our cultural heritage. And then maybe share some of your own as well. So we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. And I'll be keeping track of them. So if you see me looking slightly distracted at some point, it's probably because I'm trying to read your questions.
And we'll also be shamelessly sharing some wonderful footage, Skype willing, and images of those historic monuments to give those stories some context, but also importantly to draw attention away from my increasingly unruly lockdown beard. Right. Let's have another story and some video. This is the first of a handful of literally tall tales. It's about a ferocious giant of a man who made his home in the stronghold that today is known as Castle Campbell in Clackmannanshire. His name was Kemp, and he was phenomenally bad-tempered, ill-mannered, and disrespectful of authority. I like him already. One day, this giant strode into the royal palace in Dunfermline, grabbed the king's dinner, and returned to his lair without a backward glance. An outraged young knight tracked Kemp down, confronted him about his table manners, and after an arduous battle, the hero slew the giant, threw his body into the burn below, and took his head back to the king in Dunfermline. So, Laura, did a hungry giant actually live at Castle Campbell?
I think we can safely say no. In this time, we should sort of think about how myths exist on a spectrum. So at one hand, we have those that we know aren't true, so like giants, but also like dragons or fairies. But that can go all the way over to myths that we know are a lot closer to the truth, and we'll definitely have some examples of that over the course of our talk today. But even these stories like this of the giant do have a grain of truth often. So to use this as an example, the Castle Campbell example, the name of the giant, Kemp, also appears in the names of forts, cairns, and other ancient monuments across Scotland, like this picture of Kemp's Castle in Angus. And according to the Dictionary of the Older Scottish Tongue, which is part of the Dictionary of the Scots Language, a great resource, a Kemp was a champion or a fighter of mighty stature and great strength. So it's possible that there was a particularly large person, or maybe just someone with a particularly large reputation, who was stealing the king's dinner at Castle Campbell.
So where do stories like this come from?
So they come from a lot of places. So we'll tell a few stories now that sort of show that. Something that we see a lot in Scotland, where we have rather changeable weather, you could say, are legends to explain some of the inexplicable features of the weather or the landscape. So one example, there's a Gaelic tradition of Bera, the queen or goddess of winter, and she built the mountains of Scotland with her magic hammer, and she used the tallest, Ben Nevis, as her throne. The longest night of the year would mark the end of her reign, when she would drink from the well of youth and get younger every day as the light returned to Scotland. And it wasn't just weather, so myths can also come from mistakes of our historical understanding sometimes. So another example of this is that there's a myth that Sir William Wallace, popular figure in Scottish history, was unusually tall, so much so that this was actually referenced in Braveheart as a joke, since Mel Gibson is not very tall. And the justification for this is often the so-called Wallace sword, which is an oversized two-handed longsword that is said to have belonged to him. However, we know that this sword is actually a later amalgamation of a few swords, and we think only one of them is actually old enough to date from him. So it's possible that it was at some point Wallace's sword, but it would have been a smaller version. But Blind Harry, in his medieval account of Wallace's exploits, does say that Wallace had a sword that was heavy and long. So perhaps he was known for having a larger sword than usual, and eventually that became conflated with his height. But we do know that sort of these large two-handed swords, like a claymore, wasn't used in Scotland for another 200 years after Wallace died. Another interesting sort of part of this myth as we're trying to unpack it is that being unusually tall is actually a trope of a medieval hero. So we see this with the bones of King Arthur and with Robert the Bruce, both of which were said to have been identified because they were much larger than the average man. So maybe it was also sort of trying to show that Wallace fit into this medieval hero kind of ideal.
Well, let's continue the tall story theme then. This is one that explains the great standing stones of the Ring of Brodgar in Orkney. So one night, a great gang of giants was crossing the Ness of Brodgar, heading home probably, when they decided to rest a while in a field. And while they were resting, one pulled out a fiddle and began to play while the rest formed a circle to dance. The ground was trembling as the colossal revelers whirled around and around, and the party just lost track of time. And suddenly dawn was upon them, and as the first rays of the sun struck their flesh, these magical beings petrified, and their huge shapes were frozen in the circle of their dance, which is a most fantastic explanation for the Neolithic stone circle that otherwise presumably made absolutely no sense to local people.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another place where we see myths used, that they're often trying to explain curious events or curious features. And in a way, we still do this. So when we're trying to look at history and understand it, we're really just looking at the information available to us and making an educated guess about the most plausible explanation. Of course, our guesses don't usually involve giants anymore, but you can absolutely see what people were trying to do in the past. It's also worth pointing out with this that the line between sort of myth and history can actually be pretty blurred. We tend to think of them as really separate things, but I don't think that's really fair. Lots of the time, we can't know exactly what actually happened in the past, so we are making guesses. And sometimes we realize that those guesses were incorrect, but it's already the popular opinion, and it's really hard to sort of get that back. I actually just this week published a blog post on the HES blog that's about one of these examples of when something sort of has gone so far beyond kind of in a mistake. And in this case, it was actually enshrined in law. So if anybody wants to see that, you'll have to go check out the blog post on the HES blog.
So, yeah, here's another example. I'm going to end my giant fixation for the moment. And this is another attempt to explain an ancient monument, which weaves loads of medieval stories around it and hints at even older stories. And this is about the Antonine Wall. So it's a 37-mile ditch and turf rampart that was built by the Romans right across Scotland more than 1,800 years ago. And to the people who later lived nearby, it must have just seemed impossible that such a vast structure was the product of human agency. And in the Middle Ages, some historians link the wall to a Scottish leader called Graham or Grim, who supposedly destroyed the wall as he led an army south into the defenseless Roman province of Britain. Now, one theory is that Grim is another name for the English god Woden, from whom we get the name Wednesday, and that long before historians such as Forden and Boyce wrote about Graham's Scottish army, early Northumbrian settlers had concluded that this powerful deity had carved out this mighty earthwork. And to this day, there are plenty of Graham's Dyke street names along the length of the wall, and indeed there are ancient earthworks across England that are known as Grim's Dyke or Ditch.
Yeah, that's sort of one of the final reasons behind myths, unlike that tale where you can certainly see where people are coming from, is that sometimes they're just made up. So oftentimes they teach a lesson, so sort of like a fable. And I think for both of us, one of our favorite examples of this, and a story I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with, is that of Robert the Bruce coming upon a spider in a cave when he was on the run. So the tale is that Bruce was feeling very dejected sort of shortly after he had been crowned king. Things were not going well for him, and he was hiding in a cave on the west coast, and he was tempted to give up and sort of just give in to all the pressure when he saw a spider trying to spin a web in this cave. And the spider kept getting knocked down by the rain, because of course it was raining, because it was Scotland. But he would just keep going. And it was a lesson in perseverance for Bruce, and then obviously for everyone who has since heard the story. Unfortunately, this lovely tale we think was made up by Walter Scott. It certainly for the first time appeared in his Tales of a Grandfather. But one of my favorite bits of this is that there are several caves on the west coast of Scotland that sort of claim to be the cave in which Bruce saw this spider. So I think it also shows the real life implications of these myths, even if we know that they aren't true.
And neither of those caves are in the care of Historic Environment Scotland, so
sadly not.
That's a shame, isn't it? This is all great fun, but should Historic Environment Scotland really care about myths when we have so much actual history to enjoy?
I think so, certainly. I think that it's a balance of both. Of course, I'm in no way suggesting that we should ignore the history that we actually know a lot more about at our sites. But I think including the myths when we're trying to understand the historic environment can reveal a lot about what people thought in the past, but then also today. So thinking back to my earlier example about Wallace and the giant sword, I think this brings up some interesting questions, like why do we expect our medieval heroes to be giant men, like I was talking about with King Arthur and Robert the Bruce as well? What does that reveal about our sort of expectations about the past and also about masculinity? I think there's lots of really interesting questions that could be asked there. And then also, as we've already referred to several times, myths can reveal a lot about what people thought. So something that's really useful for us is that sometimes they can explain the sort of role of myth in pre-Christianity religion and rituals. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of these myths because they were suppressed or forgotten when Christianity came to Scotland. But we do sometimes get hints of these rituals or beliefs. And one really famous example is how structures can be aligned with the summer solstice. And one example is one of our properties, Maze Howe in Orkney, where the sun sort of aligns with the door. And another interesting phenomenon, again, some more of our properties, is the linear cemetery of burial cairns in Kilmartin Glen, which certainly seem to be set in a pretty clear line down the glen in a way that seems quite purposeful, but we don't really know why or what that meant to people who were actually doing it.
Yeah, it's a great frustration that I'm unaware of any good folk tales that seek to explain that. I wonder if anybody watching this has heard of such a thing. That'd be lovely to hear. And this brings me on to something that nagged at me for a few years now, and that's the hints of lost tales, stories that have gone and have just left a little hint behind. So there are places like Uchagallen in Arran, Uchagallen meaning, don't get me to try and pronounce the Gaelic, it's practice, but it means the field of the standing stones. And there's no accompanying legend now to explain what was understood, what people thought these stones might have meant. And there's this wonderful image of a Pictish rider, and it's displayed at Dunkeld Cathedral. It shows this rider on a horse, breaking all the rules. He's drinking and driving here from a drinking horn. And a similar scene was found at a picture stone at Invergowrie, not too far away. That second stone is displayed in the National Museum now. It has a lot more detail to it. And this guy is sitting on a definite nag of a horse. You can see his ribs, and he's quite a portly guy, and he's really drinking deep as he goes along the road. Now, there's no other explanation as to who this person is, but they're clearly sharing the same story about a character that people living in that part of the world, maybe 1,300 years ago, they would have all known it instantly. They knew who this guy was, but it's lost to us. We've just got this hint at an old guy having a drink while riding a horse.
Yeah, was it a famous story, a local eccentric character? Who knows? We do have a question, Steve, which actually I think would be a good one for you to answer, maybe. So we've got a suggestion from Heritage Harvest that we should create a myth guide for our properties. Do we have one, or are there any plans for one in the works?
There isn't a plan. It's an intriguing idea. I think one issue is the legends that we find is pretty uneven. And so some of our monuments are absolutely full of these sorts of story, and others, not just bigger gasworks, have fewer folk tales associated with them. So we have a challenge there to really cover areas. Personally, I like to weave them in with the history. So there are different textures of story, different tones of story. So when you visit a property, all sorts of different things are there to tell you about why this place is special. And folktales do that brilliantly alongside the history. But yeah, if there was such a guide to folktales at our monuments, I'd probably buy a copy myself.
I was just thinking the same thing. Yeah, I wonder if there's something with that there's something about actually being in that space that's really adds to it as well. That's why we were really keen to try to show lots of pictures and things during our discussion today to give people that sense of where these are actually coming from based on the place that you're in.
Well, it goes back to something you said, that when we talk about the history of these places, when you're at the place where history happened, that's rather magical. But there's also this other history that didn't happen, but people thought it did. And that's another layer of meaning. And to be in that place where, I don't know, people thought giants had a party, that's kind of wonderful, isn't it? That people looked to that stone circle or up the ravine to Castle Campbell and told a story about this figure that we know doesn't exist, but they didn't think that. They thought something different. Let me tell you another story. This is a curious myth from Melrose Abbey in the Borders. It's not really funny, it's more interesting. And it was written down in the 1100s by the English churchman known as William of Newbury. And William writes that a chaplain, a personal chaplain, who led quite a profane life, he was known, I believe, as the Hund Priest, because he liked hunting with dogs so much, not your typical churchman activity. Anyway, he died, and then he refused to stay in the grave that had been placed in near the abbey. And his ghastly form moaned and groaned and terrified local people in Melrose. So 4 Melrose monks decided to stake out his final resting place. And because none of them had ever seen an episode of Scooby-Doo, just before midnight, 3 of them decided to nip indoors to keep warm and leave the youngest one just to watch over the grave on his own. And of course, that's when the dead chaplain chose to rise up out of the earth. Now, the novice priest was clearly frightened, but he wasn't stupid because he'd brought an axe with him. And he just battered the chaplain back into the afterlife. And then when his friends turned up, they dug up the grave once more and burned the wounded corpse, if you can have such a thing, burned it to ashes and scattered the ashes, and the Revenant didn't come back. Laura, we know that didn't happen, I hope. So what should Historic Environment Scotland do with such stories?
It's a really good question. So of course, we do have a responsibility to make sure that the information that we are releasing to the public is as, quote unquote, accurate as possible. But as we've been saying, myths can really tell us a lot about the past, and plus they're really fun and people like reading about them at our sites. So I think a big part of the job for both of our teams is to try to parse out the history from the myth, but then also to know when to put the myth back in. For example, when it does help with our understanding of some of our properties in care, particularly sort of some of our more ancient properties. So we research folklore stories as best we can, looking not into whether, for example, from a story that if a magical cow actually fed people on Lewis from amid the stones of Callanish, which is another excellent story, but on how people have told and valued stories, trying to stay as true to their beliefs as possible. So with that story of the magic cow, for example, it suggests maybe that hunger was something that people were worried about, and that a magical cow that continuously fed people is something that would be very welcome to people. And then, as I said, we can't discount that myths are really fun. And people like hearing about dragons and monsters and magic cows. And also, clearly, people like us really like telling them. So I think it's really important to sort of balance the fact and the fiction in that situation. And speaking of, we've got another comment that's relevant to this conversation. This is from John, who was talking about a devil that was seen walking on the walls of Blackness Castle after it was burnt during Cromwell's siege. Do we have anything to say on that?
I didn't know that story. That's a great one, isn't it? You do think that some of these stories are they emerge after the event to tell you what you should think about what's happened. Is it good that Cromwell's burnt the castle? Well, the devil's walking on the walls. It clearly wasn't. There's an interesting one with Mary Queen of Scots. We have a very strange report that a dragon is seen flying over Edinburgh Castle, and that this is linked to Mary Queen of Scots. And the message there seems to be, well, she's not a great person, is she? If she's associated with dragons flying, it's calamity and all the rest of it. So you can probably guess that it was a story that was prevalent among her enemies. So no, I didn't know that story. That's a great one.
Yeah, I didn't either. I'm going to look that up.
I was just going to add something to the Callanish cow as well. We can take out that wonderful story about famine, and I've not really thought of it in those terms. That's a rather nice way of doing it. But we've also got a very strange end to that story, that the cow basically says, look, I'll fill up whatever container you provide. And a witch gets wind of what's going on and brings a sieve, and the cow can't fill the sieve, obviously. And the cow disappears, and the local population lose this wonderful source of milk. And witches and sieves, that's a combination that crops up again and again. I think we've got one off of in the Firth of Forth, where the witches who are supposedly plotting to kill James VI go to sea in a sieve. That's part of their backstory, if you like. I've not looked into that one, but it's a lovely idea, the sort of counterintuitive idea that you can go to sea in something that's clearly pretty rubbish as a boat, a sieve. But when you look at all these stories, and I think you might have guessed by the way I flannelled about the Blackness devil projection, that's a lovely one. This all means research, every bit as historical research needs research. So we carry out our own historical research to find out and test stories about our properties. Not every story that's associated with our properties is true. We need to test and see how well supported they are by evidence. And we work with as many experts as we can to do that, specialists, to work alongside our own specialists. And we do the same for folklore to a much lesser extent at the moment, but we include that in that approach. So, for instance, we collaborated with the marvelous Orcadian storyteller Tom Muir to create that reconstruction illustration you saw earlier of the Trow of Careen Hill. Who else could we go to ask advice about a fictitious creature like that? And in a similar fashion, we work with Gaelic scholar Don William Stewart from Soma Rospig to reconstruct a scene of the Fenian hero Fingal with his hound Bran and a cooking pot placed on top of a stone circle in Arran, which is part of the Macri Moor complex. And the stone circle has the wonderful name of Fingal's Cauldron Seat. This was the pot stand he used to cook his dinner. And when we did this, we decided that the reconstruction illustration of Fingal shouldn't be harking back to the character in the Fenian cycle of stories. It should be reconstructed to match the 19th century idea of Fingal, that 19th century hero, although it's a 19th century idea of a medieval hero, should I say. And so we reconstructed the hero to have the costume and appearance that would match that particular viewpoint. We want to get the myth right. I know it didn't exist, but we still want to get it right, to respect the story itself, as we think it might once have been told. And that's about authenticity, I think. And that's every bit as important as getting historical detail correct, I think. So, Laura, with all this research, shouldn't we be myth busting? How do you feel about that?
Well, I have something of a personal vendetta against the term myth busting. And it's because I think it makes myths sound like something that we need to get rid of, which I think is probably clear by now. I completely disagree with. So of course we need to acknowledge whether they are factual or not. And as you say, try to make sure that the myths that we are telling are sort of as authentic as they can be, especially if we are taking them as something of the past. We need to make sure that they're reflecting what they would have been in the past. But they certainly aren't, myths aren't inherently a bad thing. And Steve, you recently introduced me to a term that I really like using instead, which is myth building. So that's shedding light on how and why a myth is built, rather than just trying to tear it down.
Yeah, we will. That approach came out of a recent project when we were retelling one of Edinburgh Castle's most notorious story, the Legend of the Black Dinner. This was for our new audio guide. So we worked with historian Christine McGladdery on this, and it seemed a shame, almost like you were destroying a story if you did that, if you myth busted. So what we did was Christine helps us track how the story builds up. So we start for its brief beginnings in a contemporary record about the beheading of the young Earl of Douglas and his younger brother after they went to the castle to meet the 10-year-old King James II in 1440. Now that story gathers detail with dark motives, with an apparent innocent dinner, and with the presentation of a black bull's head to signal the seizure of the noblemen and their summary execution. And that flourish was, of course, courtesy of Walter Scott. Now that mythologized story is still developing today. I love this. The whole episode inspired the shocking Red Wedding in the Game of Thrones books and TV series. And that's been enjoyed by millions around the world. And if you want to hear that story, you can by going to the official Edinburgh Castle website, find the tours, guides, and itineraries section, click on that, go onto the audio guide, Edinburgh Castle audio guide, and have a listen to stop 201. And you'll get to hear Christine and George R.R. Martin explain the wonderful creation of the Black Dinner story. Of course, we don't know how much of that's myth and how much of that's truth, and how much of it might have been oral tradition that emerged later. So we'll leave that to you to work out.
Absolutely. We've got another question. Well, we've got a few questions, actually. So here's a really interesting one from Bryony, who asks, do the myths and legends you've come across tend to relate to specific places, or do you find variations on the same story all over Scotland or Europe? I actually had an interesting bit of this recently where my line manager actually was telling me about when he grew up in Ayrshire, that it was bad luck to step on a spider or it would rain. And we were questioning whether this was related to the Bruce and the spider story, and if it was sort of a local history. And I was telling my mom in Canada this story, and she was like, "Oh yeah, no, it's bad luck to step on a spider. You should never do that. It'll rain," which I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see site-specific stories turn up again and again. So there's an Edinburgh story about a piper going into a tunnel to find out where the tunnel goes. So the piper plays, and everyone on the surface, what an unlucky piper. Everyone on the surface, they can hear where the piper is. They can hear where the tunnel is somehow by hearing the drone of his pipes as he goes through the tunnel. And then, of course, it stops, and they never see the piper again. And the same story is told in Curos about a piper who goes in the tunnels underneath the abbey, underneath the town rather, and people track the tunnel that's leading, I believe, to the West Church outside of Curos. And suddenly the piping stops. And that's the last you hear of the piper. And in Curos's case, you have coal mines, one famously going under the Firth of Forth. So this is a place that's very familiar with tunnels. And Edinburgh Castle, well, you can imagine there's a fair few tunnels there. And I came across the same story at Ben Gullion by Campbelltown, exactly the same story. I mean, how many pipers were these people getting? It's a dangerous occupation. But the same story comes up. And there's another one at some cliffs by Cairnaghet, up in Caithness, where we have a story of the last Pict. Probably not got time to tell you the full story, but basically there's one Pict left, and there's two Picts, and they know the secret of making heather ale. And the Scots want to know how you make heather ale. So the Scots king dragged the last Pict in front of him and said, "You've got to tell me, how do I make this drink?" And the Pict said, "On one condition." He said, "Fine." He goes, "You kill my son." That's the other Pict. And the Scots king thinks this is a bit odd and kills his son. And then says, "Right, now tell me." And he goes, "No, I'm going to go to the grave, but I wasn't sure my son would die, wouldn't betray the secret, so you'll never know." And I thought that's a great story. And we tell it, admittedly, in 2 sentences at Cairnaghet in Caithness. And then I heard the same story again from the West Coast. So these stories float around, and sometimes they get reattached to a new location. But that's quite magical. I mean, I think there's enough room for 3 potholing bagpipers and a couple of last Picts, I think.
Absolutely, yes. We've got another question from Heidi asking, are there any places or structures constructed based on local myth or legend as opposed to the myths constructed based on the places? That's a good question.
That's a lovely question, isn't it? I wish I had an answer to it. Can we give it some thought and we can contact you back?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we can come back into the chat later and answer some of these. A sort of more modern example that I can think of is where commemorations are made to sort of like reinforce a story. So one place that has this is Elderslie, the probable birthplace of William Wallace. Although, it's hard for us to know for sure, but there have been so many monuments and other commemorations to Wallace built in Elderslie based on that is sort of the common belief now. It's like, well, of course he was born there because there's all these commemorations to him. So they can certainly be used to kind of reinforce stories and things. Definitely. We've also got a comment saying that, about the St. Mungo story, about the salmon on the ring. Which maybe you might know better than me, Steve, but I believe it's about the Glasgow origin story. And it is word for word the same as the San Rosendo story, apparently.
Oh, right. I didn't know that. Yeah, it's a grand story. And it does crop up, I think, in Athenian legend as well. I think. Well, I could be wrong there. Yeah, and you do see legends getting joined together. There's a sort of, if you like, the story of St Mungo is parts 4, 5, and 6 of the 9-part medieval Star Wars series of movies. A prologue is about St Cerf. It doesn't seem that St Cerf's legend is attached to St Mungo initially, and then later on they sort of saying, we really like the St Cerf stories and we love the St Mungo stories, so we'll make St Cerf Mungo's tutor. But in early versions of St Cerf's story, there's no connection that we can see. And St Cerf is really important in Curos, an enormously important figure in the early church, as much as St Mungo is in the west of Scotland. Yeah, I'm still pondering whether I can think of a monument that is commemorating a legend. It's going to bother me, that one.
I know, it's a good... Yeah, as soon as we hang up, you'll think of it and have to go back in the chat.
Yes.
Yes. Well, speaking of, I am conscious that I think we are coming to the end of our time. So as I mentioned earlier, I have written a blog post that goes into some other myths. So if you would like to hear more about this, please go check that out. And please do share your favorite myths and legends in the comments of that. I think we'll be sharing some of them. So please do comment if you've got any good ones for us.
Absolutely. And do look out for our retelling of some of these myths and legends the next time you get a chance to visit one of our wonderful sites. And we will come back and answer further questions if anyone wants to post up further questions after the broadcast is over, and we'll do our best to answer them. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your comments and questions. Thank you for this opportunity for me to waffle on telling some of these stories. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.